The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl dig beneath a snowbank, and the item she pulled out shouldn't have existed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a cold winter afternoon, with snow blanketing the ground, a biker named Jake was making his way down a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. His Harley-Davidson roared beneath him, the sound of its engine cutting through the silence of the snowy landscape. Jake had been riding for hours, lost in his own thoughts, when something caught his eye. There, in the distance, was a small figure, something that didn't quite fit in with the otherwise empty scene. A little girl, no older than 10, was kneeling by a snowbank, frantically digging through the thick layer of snow. His instincts as a Hells Angels rider told him to keep moving, to avoid getting involved. But something about the scene felt different. Curiosity and concern nudged him to stop. He killed the engine and dismounted, stepping through the snow toward the child. The air was frigid, the wind biting, but the girl didn't seem to notice. She was determined, digging with her small hands as though she had a specific purpose. As Jake approached, he could see her shivering, her face pale, but her focus was unwavering. "Hey there," Jake called out, his voice rough from the cold. The girl didn't respond right away, but her head slowly turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were wide with fear, but also with something else, an urgency. "What are you doing out here, kid?" Jake asked, trying to keep his tone gentle, though his protective instincts were kicking in. I'm looking for something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I know it's here." Jake crouched down beside her, glancing at the snowbank. "What are you looking for?" he asked, though he didn't expect her to give him a straightforward answer. She didn't immediately answer, her hands still digging through the snow. Then, with a gasp, she pulled something out. It was small, metal, and covered in dirt. Jake's eyes widened when he saw it. It was an old, rusted key. Not just any key, it looked ancient, like it had been buried here for decades. But there was something else about it, something that felt wrong. Why would a child be digging for something like this in the snow? And why had she found it here, in the middle of nowhere? The girl held the key tightly in her small hands, her breath quick and shallow. "It's for the door," she whispered, almost as if to herself. "The door in the forest. I have to find it." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The key didn't make sense. There was no door in the forest, at least not any he knew of. His mind raced with possibilities. What was this girl talking about? What kind of door? What did the key open? And why had she been searching for it in the cold snow? "I can help you find it," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he believed what he was saying. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "You have to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only way." As the wind howled around them, Jake knew he couldn't walk away now. There was something far bigger at play here than just a little girl digging in the snow. Whatever this key unlocked, whatever mystery it held, he had to know more. He stood up, looking down at the girl who was now clutching the key like her life depended on it. "All right," Jake said, his voice steady. "Let's find that door." Little did he know, this discovery was about to lead them down a path that neither of them could have ever anticipated. Jake helped the little girl up, holding her with one hand while the other tightly gripped the ancient, rusted key she had found in the snow. Her small fingers were trembling, but she didn't let go. The air around them was bitterly cold, the snow continuing to fall in soft, swirling flakes. Jake glanced at the girl's face, her wide eyes staring at the key, as if she knew its importance but didn't quite understand its meaning. They both stood there for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. He didn't know what had brought her out into the cold, digging through the snow for something so mysterious, but there was no turning back now. "Where do we go now?" Jake asked, his voice softer than he intended. The girl turned towards him, her breath visible in the air, and for a moment, Jake could see a flicker of something in her eyes, fear mixed with a strange sense of determination. "The door," she said quietly. "It's in the forest. I've been looking for it for so long." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the forest was vast, filled with dense trees and endless paths, but he'd never heard of a door hidden somewhere in it. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. Was this a wild goose chase, or was there some truth to her words? "What door?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "The one that opens everything," she said with a certainty that made Jake pause. "I have to find it. I promised." Promised? Jake didn't ask her to elaborate. Instead, he just nodded. He couldn't say no now, not with the way she was looking at him, like he was her only chance. Without another word, he started walking, the girl following closely behind. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way toward the forest edge. It wasn't far, just a few hundred feet, but the woods here were thick with trees, and the air seemed colder once they crossed the line into the forest. Jake could feel the weight of the silence surrounding them. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the world was closing in. The girl's pace was quick, her small form moving through the trees with ease, her eyes darting around like she was tracking something. Jake kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning the area around them. He didn't know what to expect, but something in his gut told him they were walking into something bigger than they could imagine. After a few minutes, the girl stopped. She turned to him, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's here," she whispered. Jake didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The trees seemed just like any other part of the forest, tall, dark, and filled with thick snow. But the girl stepped forward, pushing through the snow and brushing aside a cluster of thick branches. There, in front of him, was a weathered wooden door, half buried in the snow. Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. The door wasn't just any door. It was old, ancient even, with carvings on the wood that he couldn't decipher. The edges were chipped and worn, as though it had been there for centuries, hidden from the world. He stepped closer, running his hand over the carvings. They were symbols, strange and unfamiliar, almost like a forgotten language. "This is it," the girl said again, her voice filled with awe. Jake turned to her, his mind still trying to catch up. "What is this?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "It's the door to everything," she said simply. "The key opens it." She held the key up, the metal gleaming in the weak light of the forest. For a moment, Jake thought he could hear something. Whispers, like distant voices, but when he looked around, there was nothing there. He turned back to the door and the girl. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "I have to." Jake hesitated for a moment before reaching out and taking the key from her small hand. He looked at it for a long moment, then slowly inserted it into the keyhole of the door. As he turned the key, the wood of the door groaned, and Jake felt a strange, almost electric tingle shoot through his fingers. The door shuddered, and for a brief moment, the air around them seemed to freeze. He pulled the door open with a creak that echoed through the trees, and what he saw beyond it made his heart race. The door didn't open into the woods. It opened into a vast, empty space, like a cavern. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal. On the pedestal was a small box, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The girl stepped forward, her eyes locked on the box. "It's here," she said, almost reverently. The answer. Jake didn't know what to think, but something deep inside him told him that whatever this was, it was just the beginning. The beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. Jake stood at the entrance of the door, his heart racing as the girl stepped past him into the cavernous room beyond. He looked back at the woods outside, the familiar snow-covered trees now a distant memory. The door had opened into something entirely different, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The walls of the room were etched with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the dim light, creating an unsettling feeling in his chest. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Jake's eyes darted to the pedestal in the center of the room. On it sat a small, glowing box. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, smooth and shiny, with intricate patterns carved into its surface. The glow seemed to pulse, faint but steady. The girl approached it cautiously, her small hand reaching out, her fingers trembling as she hovered just above the box. Jake stayed close behind her, unsure of what to do next. "Is this it?" Jake asked, his voice low. The girl nodded without turning around, her eyes fixed on the box. "Yes," she whispered. "This is what I've been searching for." The answer. Jake didn't know what answer she was talking about, but something about the way she said it made his gut tighten. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the box as well. "What happens when we open it?" he asked. The girl turned to him, her face a mixture of fear and anticipation. I don't know, she said quietly. But I have to. With those words, she reached forward and lifted the box from its pedestal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as if they were coming to life. The symbols on the walls shifted, glowing brighter, casting strange shadows that danced across the cavern. Jake took a step back, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. The girl held the box tightly, her eyes locked on it as though she could feel its power. What is it? Jake asked again, his voice rising with unease. She opened the box slowly, the lid creaking as it moved. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper. The girl picked it up with shaking hands and unfolded it carefully. Jake couldn't see what was written on it, but he could tell by the way the girl's face changed that it was important. Her eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. This is, she whispered, but her voice trailed off, too soft for Jake to hear. What is it? Jake pressed, stepping closer. The girl turned to him, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held the paper out for him to see. It's a map, she said, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Jake took the paper from her, his eyes scanning it quickly. It was a map, but not of any place he recognized. The locations marked on it were unfamiliar, and the lines drawn on it seemed to lead deeper into the forest, into a place Jake had never been. What's this? He asked, his mind racing. It's a map to the door, the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. The real one, the one that leads to everything. Jake stared at the map in disbelief. He didn't know what to think. A door that led to everything? What did that even mean? And why was the girl so sure about it? The door? He repeated, trying to make sense of it all. The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving the map. It's in the forest, she said. The key opens it, but this map shows where to find it. Where it's hidden. Jake's thoughts raced. This wasn't just a simple discovery. It was something much bigger, something that felt like it had been buried for years, maybe even centuries. He looked back at the glowing box, his hand still holding the map. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jake could feel a strange pull to the map, as if it was calling him to something unknown. So what happens if we find it? Jake asked. What happens if we open this door? The girl didn't answer right away. She just stared at the map, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and hope. I don't know, she said finally, but I have to find out. Jake took a deep breath, glancing back at the entrance to the cavern. The world outside felt so far away now, like a memory from another life. The path before them was unclear, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away now. Whatever this was, whatever they were about to discover, he was in it for the long haul. The girl looked up at him, her face full of determination. Are you coming? She asked. Jake nodded, feeling a strange sense of purpose rise within him. Let's find that door. With the map in hand and the box glowing in the background, they turned back toward the forest. The snow outside had stopped falling, but the air still felt heavy with anticipation. The world had just shifted, and whatever lay ahead, Jake knew they were about to uncover something that could change everything. Jake and the girl made their way through the forest, the air growing colder as the trees closed in around them. The snow had stopped falling, but the heavy stillness of the woods felt like it was pressing in on them. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the trees themselves were watching. Jake's eyes never strayed far from the map. He could feel the weight of it in his hands, as though it was guiding them towards something he couldn't yet understand. How much further? Jake asked, glancing at the girl. Her pace was steady, almost too calm for the situation. She didn't seem tired at all, despite the long walk through the thick forest. Not much farther, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's close. I can feel it. Jake looked around, his gaze sweeping the trees, but all he saw were the shadows stretching across the snow-covered ground. The forest was dense, with the trunks of the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. The only sounds were the crunching of their boots on the snow and the occasional rustling of the branches. What exactly are we looking for? Jake asked. The girl didn't answer right away. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, the map clutched tightly in her hand. You'll know when we find it, she said, her voice distant, almost as though she was speaking to herself. Jake didn't ask her to explain. He had learned by now that this was how things worked with her. She didn't explain anything until it was absolutely necessary. They walked on in silence for what felt like an eternity, the snow crunching beneath their feet and the cold biting at their skin. Jake's mind was racing. He still didn't understand why the girl had led him here, why she was so certain that this door, this key, and this map were so important. He had been part of the Hells Angels for too long to believe in anything that wasn't rooted in violence or power. But there was something about her, something that made him want to trust her. As they approached a small clearing in the woods, Jake's eyes caught something in the distance. There, partially hidden by the trees, was a large stone structure. It was overgrown with moss, and the stone was weathered with age, but there was no mistaking it. This was the place the map had led them to. The girl stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with recognition. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible. Jake could see the excitement in her face, but also the fear. He felt it too, a knot in his stomach as he looked at the structure ahead. It wasn't just a building. It was a door, carved into the rock itself. The symbols from the map were etched into the stone, and the air around it seemed to hum with an almost electric energy. Jake's pulse quickened as they drew closer. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low. The girl stepped forward, her eyes locked on the door. "It's the door," she whispered. "The one that leads to everything." Jake wasn't sure if he believed her, but there was something about the way she said it that made him hesitate. He had seen enough to know that sometimes the impossible was real. She reached out, her small hand brushing against the stone door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols on the door began to glow faintly, a soft light that grew brighter with each passing second. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew thick with a strange, almost overwhelming energy. Jake took a step back, his heart racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing. They were on the brink of something huge, something that could change everything. The girl turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "The key," she said, holding it out to him. Jake's hand trembled as he took the key from her. It felt heavy in his palm, as though it carried the weight of centuries. He knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, placing the key into the lock. The door groaned, the stone shifting as if it had been waiting for this moment. With a deep breath, Jake turned the key. The door opened with a loud creak, revealing a dark passageway beyond. A cold draft rushed past them, carrying with it a sense of ancient power. Jake looked at the girl, his mind still reeling from what was happening. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with doubt. The girl nodded, her face set in determination. "I have to go through. It's the only way." Jake hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped into the doorway, the girl close behind him. As they crossed the threshold, the air around them seemed to change. The walls of the passageway were made of smooth stone, and the faint glow of the symbols on the walls illuminated the path ahead. Jake's mind raced as they walked deeper into the darkness. What was at the end of this passage? What was this door truly leading to? The farther they went, the more Jake felt like they were being pulled into something much bigger than either of them could understand. But he couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. He glanced at the girl, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the walls. She seemed so sure, so certain of what they were doing. For the first time in a long time, Jake wasn't sure of anything, but he knew one thing. Whatever lay ahead, it was something they couldn't ignore. They continued down the passageway, the air growing colder as they went, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps. Whatever was at the end of this journey, Jake couldn't deny that it was calling to them both. And there was no turning back. Jake and the girl continued down the dark passage, the air growing colder with each step they took. The glow from the stone walls dimmed as they walked further into the cavernous space, and Jake's instincts began to tingle with unease. He had always trusted his gut, especially when he was in unknown territory. And right now, everything about this place screamed danger. But the girl, she was different. She wasn't afraid. She seemed to know exactly where they were going, even though Jake had no idea what lay ahead. Her eyes were focused, locked on the faint light that seemed to guide them deeper into the darkness. The key, now resting in Jake's hand, felt warm against his palm, as if it was alive. He glanced at the girl, who was walking ahead of him. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed on the path ahead, her footsteps soft and steady. When she finally spoke, it was in a voice that was barely audible. "We're almost there," she said, her tone distant, as though she was speaking from some place deep inside herself. Jake nodded, but the unease in his chest only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The deeper they went, the less real it felt, as if they were stepping into a place that didn't belong in the world they knew. The walls of the passage began to narrow, the ceiling lowering, and the air grew heavier, thick with an energy that felt ancient. It was almost as if the stone itself was alive, pulsing with something beyond human understanding. "What's at the end of this?" Jake asked, his voice echoing off the walls. The girl stopped for a moment and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe fear. "I don't know," she whispered, "but we have to find it. It's the only way to stop it." "Stop what?" Jake asked, but before she could answer, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Jake grabbed the girl's arm instinctively, steadying her as the ground trembled. The walls seemed to shift, the symbols glowing brighter now, and the low hum of the room grew louder. It wasn't just an earthquake. This felt intentional, like something was waking up. The girl looked at him, her face pale. "We have to hurry," she said, her voice urgent now. "It's going to be too late if we don't." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. They moved faster, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder, and the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed like a heartbeat. Jake's heart was racing, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, an adrenaline-fueled rush, the kind he had felt during countless runs, when the stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. They rounded a corner and finally came to a stop. In front of them was a large stone door, covered in more symbols, much like the one they had seen earlier. But this one was different. It was more elaborate, and the air around it seemed to crackle with energy. The girl stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the door. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where it all ends." Jake took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't know what she meant, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the moment. He reached out and pressed the key into the lock, his hand shaking as he turned it. The door groaned, and the ground trembled beneath them. For a moment, everything seemed to stop, and then, with a loud crash, the door flew open. The room beyond was bathed in a strange, ethereal light, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and dread. The girl stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder, but also with something darker. She knew what was behind that door. Jake didn't, but he was about to find out. They crossed the threshold together, the air growing colder as they entered the new space. It was vast, a cavernous room that stretched out before them, filled with ancient relics and strange machinery. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, was something that glowed with an eerie light. It was a large, crystalline object, pulsing with energy. Jake could feel the power radiating from it, and it made his skin prickle. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse with awe. The girl stepped forward, her gaze locked on the object. "This is what we've been looking for," she said, her voice trembling. "This is the key to everything." Jake didn't understand, but he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Together, they approached the object, and as they got closer, the energy in the room seemed to intensify. The air was thick with the hum of power, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The girl reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the crystal. The moment her fingers made contact, a blinding light filled the room, and Jake had to shield his eyes. The light was so bright it felt like it was searing into his soul. The ground beneath them shook, and Jake felt a strange pull, as if something was calling to him. When the light finally faded, everything was still. The girl was standing in front of the crystal, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Jake moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "What happened?" he asked. The girl looked at him, her voice shaking. It started." And as Jake looked around the room, he realized that whatever was happening was far from over. Jake stood frozen, staring at the crystalline object that now pulsed with an even more intense glow, as though it had awakened something deep within the earth itself. The air around them was thick with an unexplainable energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The girl, her face pale, stood transfixed by the crystal, her fingers still pressed against its surface. Jake's heart raced, the pulsing light creating an eerie rhythm in the room. almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving the girl. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile tension in the air. The girl didn't answer right away. Her lips trembled, her eyes locked onto the crystal with a mix of wonder and fear. "It's starting," she said, her voice breaking as she pulled her hand away from the glowing surface. "I didn't think it would happen so soon. It's alive." Jake's pulse quickened. He couldn't understand what she meant by "it's alive," but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever this was, it wasn't something he had bargained for. The room seemed to hum now, the vibrations in the stone walls intensifying. Jake felt as though the very ground beneath his feet was alive, shifting, awakening to something that had been dormant for centuries. He glanced around the cavern, his mind racing. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their movements growing more frantic, as though they were alive too, reacting to the energy in the air. "We need to leave," Jake said, taking a step back. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of this place before whatever was happening escalated any further. But the girl didn't move. She was staring at the crystal, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. "I can't," she whispered. "This is where it all ends. This is the only way." Jake's heart sank. He couldn't understand why she was so calm, so determined. There was a part of him that wanted to run, to drag her out of this place and never look back. But another part, the part that had been trained to face danger head-on, couldn't turn his back now. "What do you mean, the only way?" he asked, his voice low and strained. The girl's eyes flickered to him, her expression distant. "The door," she said, barely able to speak. "The door that leads to everything. It was sealed for a reason. It was meant to stay hidden." Jake felt a chill wash over him. What was she talking about? The door? The map? The key? It was all starting to feel like a bad dream. He looked at the girl, trying to understand. "What door?" he asked, his voice a little more forceful this time. The girl took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. "It's the door that connects everything," she whispered. "The door that controls everything. But it was locked away, hidden from the world. Only those who are meant to find it can open it." Jake's mind was spinning. He didn't know whether to believe her, but something in her voice told him that she believed it wholeheartedly. And the way the room felt, the way the air seemed to crackle with power, made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to her words. He took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the glowing crystal. "What happens if we open it?" he asked. The girl didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked at him with a strange mixture of fear and hope. "We can't stop it," she said, her voice trembling. "Once the door is opened, there's no going back. Everything will change. And I don't know if we're ready for what comes next." Jake felt his heart race again, but this time it was for a different reason. He wasn't sure if he was ready either, but he knew that there was no turning back. The door, the map, the key, everything had led them to this moment. He had no choice now but to move forward. "We can do this," Jake said, more to himself than to the girl. "We have to." She nodded, a small, sad smile crossing her face. "I hope you're right," she whispered. The ground beneath their feet rumbled again, louder this time, shaking the very foundations of the cavern. The crystal began to glow brighter, the light now blinding. Jake squinted, his eyes stinging from the intensity of the light, but he didn't look away. The air around them grew heavier, and a low, resonating hum filled the room. It was like the earth itself was alive, reacting to the crystal, to the door that was about to be opened. Without another word, Jake stepped forward, his hand reaching for the crystal. As his fingers made contact with the surface, the hum intensified, the vibrations shaking him to his core. The girl stepped back, her eyes wide with fear and awe. Jake could feel the power coursing through him, through the very walls of the cavern. The ground shook, the light from the crystal blinding, and then, nothing. The hum ceased, the vibrations stopped, and the room was still. For a moment, Jake thought nothing had changed. But then, the stone walls began to move. Slowly, the walls shifted, revealing a new passageway, one that hadn't been there before. The door had opened, and whatever lay ahead, Jake knew, would change everything. Jake stood still, staring at the newly revealed passageway. The walls of the cavern had shifted, stones sliding against stone, to uncover a dark corridor that stretched far into the unknown. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jake's heart raced as he glanced at the girl, her face illuminated by the faint, eerie glow from the crystal. She was barely breathing, her eyes wide, her expression a mix of fear, awe, and something else, something he couldn't place. The energy in the room was palpable, almost suffocating, but the girl's grip on the map tightened as if it was her lifeline. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where it all ends." Jake didn't know what she meant by that, but he felt the weight of her words deep in his chest. The tension in the air was heavy, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The girl stepped forward, her feet moving almost instinctively toward the newly opened passage. Jake followed, but the closer they got, the more he could feel the ground beneath them tremble. It was as though the very structure of the earth was shifting, adjusting to whatever was about to unfold. The passageway was narrow, the walls close, and the ceiling low. The air was colder, but the further they moved, the more the light seemed to pulse, as if responding to their presence. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridor. The girl's pace was steady, almost determined, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, aware of their every movement. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls were covered in strange markings now, symbols that seemed to shift and change as they passed. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending, warping around them. Jake's skin crawled, and he found himself gripping the girl's hand tighter. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice low and cautious. The girl didn't answer right away. She just kept walking, her eyes focused ahead. "It's where it all began," she finally said, her voice distant. "This is where the truth lies." The door was sealed for a reason. No one was supposed to find it. Jake's heart skipped a beat at her words. The truth? What truth? He didn't know if he was ready for whatever lay at the end of this journey, but he couldn't stop now. They reached a small chamber, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, and on it, glowing softly, was another crystal. This one was different, much larger, and the energy around it was almost suffocating. It was as though the very air was charged with power. The girl stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the crystal. She reached out, her hand trembling, and Jake watched as she gently touched it. The moment her fingers made contact, the entire room seemed to shudder. The walls groaned, the floor beneath them vibrated, and Jake could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The girl's eyes widened, and she gasped. It's happening," she whispered. Jake didn't understand what she meant, but the power in the room was growing stronger. The crystal pulsed with energy, brighter now, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with a strange intensity. It was as if they were alive, reacting to the crystal's power. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear and confusion. The girl didn't answer. She was staring at the crystal, her face pale. "This is the source," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where it all started. The power that controls everything. It was hidden here for a reason." Jake stepped forward, his hand on the girl's shoulder. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the pull of the crystal, the way it seemed to be drawing him in. "We need to leave," Jake said urgently. "This is too much. We don't know what this is." The girl didn't move. She stood there, her hand still pressed against the crystal, her eyes distant. "We can't leave," she whispered. "This is the only way." Before Jake could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls cracked, and Jake heard a deep, resonating sound, like thunder, echoing through the chamber. The girl's grip on the crystal tightened, and suddenly, the air was filled with a blinding light. Jake shielded his eyes, feeling the heat radiating from the crystal. It was like standing in the middle of a storm, the power of it all crashing down around them. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The light faded, and the room was still again. Jake blinked, trying to adjust his vision. The girl was standing there, her hand still on the crystal, but her face was different. She looked as though she had aged years in a matter of seconds. Her eyes were wide, filled with understanding, but also with something darker. "It's done," she said, her voice trembling. "We've opened it." Jake looked around the room, his mind racing. The chamber felt different now. The energy that had filled it moments ago was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. The world they had just uncovered was not the one they had left behind. He looked at the girl, who now seemed like a stranger. "What have we done?" he asked, his voice thick with dread. The girl turned to him, her face unreadable. "We've opened the door," she said, her voice hollow. "And now we have to face the consequences." Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as the last remnants of the blinding light faded from the crystal, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. The girl stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the glowing surface, her eyes wide and distant, like someone lost in a memory she couldn't escape. Jake couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread, the realization that they had crossed some invisible line settling deep in his gut. What had they unleashed? What had they just done? He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the stone floor, the echo loud in the otherwise silent room. "What now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. The girl didn't immediately respond. Her gaze was fixed on the crystal, her fingers trembling slightly as she withdrew her hand. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and Jake could see the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. "Now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We wait." "Wait," Jake repeated, his brow furrowing. "For what?" She slowly turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "For the consequences," she said softly. Jake's stomach churned. The energy in the room felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. The stone walls around them seemed to close in, their once faint glow now pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. It felt like the room was alive, reacting to whatever they had done. "This isn't over," Jake said, his voice tense. "Whatever we've done, it's just begun." The girl nodded, her face pale. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I couldn't stop. I didn't know how." Jake clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. "You didn't know how? You let us here. You opened the door. Now what?" He took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger rising within him. "What happens next?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the crystal. The light inside it flickered, pulsing in a rhythm that almost seemed like a heartbeat. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their intricate designs shifting and rearranging. Jake could feel the power in the air growing, building like a storm ready to break. He took another step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the girl's arm. "This place, this thing, what is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had arrived, he saw a flicker of uncertainty. "It's a power," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. "A force that controls everything, but it's been sealed away for a reason. Whoever finds it, whoever opens it," she trailed off, her words hanging in the air like a warning. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. A power that controls everything? That sounded impossible, like something out of a legend or a nightmare. "You said it was sealed away," Jake said, trying to piece it together. "But why? Why did someone seal it if it's so powerful?" She shook her head, her expression grim. "Because whoever controls it can bend the world to their will," she said. "It's not just a power. It's a weapon. A force that can destroy or reshape everything." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on his chest like a stone. A weapon. He had known danger, had fought his way through countless battles in his life, but nothing prepared him for this. They had opened a door to something that could change everything, and now they had to face the consequences. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the light from the crystal growing brighter until it was almost blinding. The walls trembled, and Jake could hear something deep within the stone, a low, rumbling sound, like the earth itself was waking up. "We have to go," Jake said urgently, grabbing the girl's arm. "This is getting out of hand. We can't stay here. We don't know what's going to happen next." But the girl didn't move. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the glowing crystal. "It's too late," she whispered. "We can't leave. We have to stay and face it. The door is open now. The power is here, and there's no turning back." Jake looked at her, fear and uncertainty in his chest. He had known the moment they walked through the door that they were heading towards something unknown, something dangerous. But now the weight of what they had uncovered was more real than ever. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. "How do we stop it?" The girl's eyes met his, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "We can't stop it," she said softly. "We can only face it." And as she spoke, Jake felt it. The shift in the air, the sense of something ancient and powerful awakening. The consequences were coming, and there was no way to avoid them now. Jake could feel the air crackling with energy as the girl's words hung in the stillness of the room. They couldn't leave. They had opened the door, and now they had to face what was coming. The walls were vibrating, and the strange hum in the air had returned, louder than ever. The symbols on the walls glowed with an intensity that almost seemed to burn through the air. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what this power was or what it could do, but he knew they were about to find out. The girl, still standing in front of the crystal, looked as though she had already accepted her fate. She wasn't afraid, but Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. Her face was pale, and there was a sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't quite understand. "We have to get out of here," Jake insisted, his voice filled with urgency. "We don't know what's coming, but we can't face it alone." The girl turned to him slowly, her expression softening. "We're not alone," she whispered. "We never were. This has always been part of the plan." Jake felt a chill run down his spine at her words. Part of the plan? What plan? He had been caught up in this whirlwind from the moment he had met her, and now he was questioning everything. Who was she really? What was she truly after? "The power," the girl said, as if reading his thoughts. "It's not just something to be controlled. It's something to be understood. This door, this crystal, it's a bridge. It connects everything. The world, the universe, the past, and the future." Jake could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. Everything. The universe. He had never believed in things like this. Hell, he had barely believed in fate until now. The room was shifting. The way the energy seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat made him question everything he knew. "How do you understand it?" Jake asked, his voice low, strained. The girl turned to face him fully now, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that made his heart skip. "You don't," she replied softly. "Not until you've seen it. Not until you've felt it. Only then will you understand what it means to control it." Jake shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "So what now? Do we just stand here and wait for it to what? Come to us?" The girl smiled faintly. "No. We have to act. We have to open our minds. We have to be ready to accept it when it comes." The ground beneath them rumbled once more, this time more violently. Jake stumbled, grabbing onto the stone pedestal to steady himself. The girl didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes focused on the crystal. The vibrations in the room were growing stronger now, shaking the very air around them. Then, without warning, a burst of light shot from the crystal, blinding Jake for a moment. He shielded his eyes, his heart racing. When the light finally dimmed, he looked up, and everything had changed. The room was no longer the same. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast expanse that stretched out before them. There was no ceiling, no floor, just an endless horizon of stars, galaxies, and swirling nebulae. It was like they had been transported to the edge of the universe itself. Jake felt as though he had stepped into a dream. The girl was still beside him, her eyes wide with awe but also with a deep understanding, as if she had known this moment would come. "This is it," she said softly. "This is the door. This is what it leads to." Jake looked around, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The stars shone brightly in the vastness, and the colors of the galaxies seemed to shift and dance in the space between them. It was beautiful, terrifying, and entirely overwhelming. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's the space between everything," the girl explained. "The space that connects us all. It's where everything begins and ends. It's where the power lies." Jake turned. To her, his mind spinning. "You mean this is what controls everything? This place?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the swirling nebulae in front of them. "Yes, but it's more than that. This is where decisions are made. This is where the future is written." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. The future, the past, the present, all of it was connected here. But how could they control something so vast, so incomprehensible? The girl took a deep breath, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "The key," she whispered. "The key opens the door to the universe. But it's not just a physical key. It's a key to your mind, to your soul." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. What was she saying? How could he possibly understand all of this? "We have to make the choice," the girl said, turning to him now. We have to decide what happens next. What we do with this power. Jake didn't know what to say. He had never been someone who believed in destiny or fate. He had always relied on himself, on what he could see, what he could touch. But now, standing in this vast space between everything, he realized that maybe there was more to the world than he had ever known. He could feel the power in the air, pressing against him like a force he couldn't escape. It was in the stars, in the galaxies, in the very fabric of space itself. He was part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The girl looked at him, her expression both kind and sad. It's your choice, Jake. What will you do with it? Jake stood in the vast, endless expanse, surrounded by swirling galaxies and shimmering stars, a deep sense of awe and confusion clouding his mind. The girl's words echoed in his ears, the weight of her statement pressing on him like an invisible force. Asterisk, it's your choice, Jake. What will you do with it? Asterisk, the power, the key, the door. All of it had brought him here, to this moment, standing at the precipice of something beyond his comprehension. His heart raced, not just from the overwhelming sense of power in the air, but from the realization of the responsibility that came with it. Could he really make a choice? Could he control something so vast, so powerful? Or would he become another pawn in the hands of something far bigger than himself? I don't know what to do, he muttered, his voice shaky, more to himself than to her. The girl turned toward him, her expression soft yet unwavering. You don't have to know everything, Jake. You just have to decide. Her voice held a calmness that Jake couldn't understand. How could she be so sure? So at peace with the enormity of what lay before them? He was used to making decisions, but nothing in his life had ever felt as critical as this. Every choice he made before had been rooted in survival. This felt different. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about shaping the future. He looked out at the endless expanse before him, the stars twinkling as if they were waiting for him to make the next move. His thoughts raced. Could he really control this power? Could anyone? What would happen if he did nothing? Would everything crumble? Or would it all fall into chaos if he made the wrong choice? The girl stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his, and Jake felt the weight of her gaze like a pull on his very soul. You're not alone in this, she said, her voice reassuring, yet there was an edge to it, an edge that suggested she wasn't entirely certain either. Whatever happens, we face it together. Jake nodded slowly, but the knot in his stomach remained tight. He wasn't sure if her words made him feel better or worse. How could they face something so vast together? What was there to face? He could feel the power humming through the air, vibrating with an intensity that made his skin prickle. There was something alive about it, something ancient and unknowable. His fingers tightened around the key in his pocket, as if the object itself was calling to him, urging him to take action. He knew what he had to do, or at least he thought he did. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence of the space. His hand reached out toward the crystal, and as his fingers brushed its surface once more, a pulse of energy shot through him. It was like being struck by lightning, and for a split second, everything around him blurred. The light from the crystal flared, brighter than before, and the room seemed to stretch and shift. The girl's voice called out to him, but it was distant, as if coming from far away. Jake, she shouted. Focus. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. The crystal was alive. The power within it was alive, and it was trying to communicate with him, to pull him deeper into its influence. He could feel it, a deep hum vibrating through his chest, sinking into his bones. The key in his pocket was pulsing now, as if it were responding to the crystal's call. With a shaking hand, Jake pulled the key out and held it up in front of him. The light from the crystal grew brighter still, and the symbols on the walls began to swirl, shifting and changing in the air like living things. He turned the key in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the weight of the decision he was about to make. He had to decide. He had to take control of this power, or risk losing everything. But as he stood there, holding the key, he realized that control was an illusion. No one could truly control something like this. It was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had ever known. I can't control it, Jake whispered, his voice thick with realization. No one can. The girl was silent for a moment, then stepped up beside him. Maybe not control it, she said softly, but we can guide it. We can shape it. We can use it, but only if we understand it. Only if we accept that we don't have all the answers. Jake turned to her, the weight of her words sinking in. It was true. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't even know what was truly at stake. But one thing was clear. They had already crossed the line. There was no going back. So what now? He asked, his voice steadying. The girl looked up at the crystal, then back at Jake. Now, she said, we make the choice to walk forward. Together. Whatever happens, we face it. Jake nodded, his hand tightening around the key. He still didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he wasn't alone. And maybe that was all he needed to know. The crystal pulsed again, and the symbols on the walls shifted, opening a new path, a path that led into the unknown. Without another word, Jake stepped forward, the girl beside him. The light from the crystal guided their way as they walked into the darkness ahead, ready to face whatever consequences came with the power they had unleashed. Jake and the girl walked deeper into the newly revealed passage, the air growing heavier with each step. The crystal's light pulsed softly behind them, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the smooth stone walls. Every step they took seemed to echo louder, the silence pressing in on them like a weight they couldn't escape. Jake's thoughts were a whirlwind, his mind still reeling from the revelation that they had opened something beyond their control. The girl, however, walked with a calm resolve, her gaze steady, her every movement purposeful. He couldn't understand how she could remain so composed. After all, they had just uncovered something so powerful, so ancient. They had no idea what they had truly unleashed. How far are we going? Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. The girl didn't answer immediately, her focus still ahead. When she did speak, her words were soft, almost drowned out by the hum of the air around them. We're almost there, she said, barely audible. It's where it all leads. Jake felt the weight of her words sink in. Where it all leads. What did that mean? What were they walking toward? As if on cue, the ground beneath them shifted. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the girl, steadying her as the passageway seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The walls groaned, low and rumbling, and the symbols etched into the stone around them flickered, as though reacting to the tremors. What is that? Jake asked, his voice tense with fear. The girl looked around, her eyes scanning the walls with a strange familiarity. It's the power, she whispered. It's waking up. It's reacting to us. Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. The power. The key. Everything they had done had led to this moment, and now the energy around them seemed to be alive, reacting to their presence. The walls seemed to close in on them, the stone narrowing, the ceiling lowering, and Jake felt as though the very passage was becoming smaller, more oppressive. They walked on, undeterred, but Jake's senses were on high alert now. Every sound, every movement, seemed amplified. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the truth of what they were doing, what they were about to face. The girl had said that once the door was opened, there was no going back. He hadn't truly understood what that meant until now. Whatever they were headed toward, it was no longer a choice. It was fate. As they moved forward, the passage finally opened up into a large, domed room. The light from the crystal illuminated the vast space before them, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it, glowing with an otherworldly radiance, was a small, intricately carved box. It was the source of the light, the source of the power. Jake could feel it even from where he stood, a pull that was almost magnetic. His feet moved on their own as he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the box without thinking. Don't touch it. The girl's voice broke through his trance. He froze, his hand hovering just above the box. She stepped closer to him, her eyes locked on the glowing object. We have to do this together, she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. We can't do it alone. If we do, the consequences will be worse than anything we can imagine. Jake looked at her, confusion clouding his mind. What did she mean? What are we supposed to do? He asked, his voice strained. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, her hand extending toward the box. The light around them seemed to intensify, the power within the room growing stronger. Jake could feel the heat radiating off the pedestal, and for a moment, he thought it might burn him. But the girl kept moving, her hand never wavering, until she reached the box. We open it together, she whispered. Only then can we understand it. Only then can we control it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know if he believed her, if he was ready for what was about to happen. But something in the air, something in the girl's voice, made him believe. This was the moment. He reached out, and together they touched the box. The moment their fingers made contact, a shock of energy coursed through them, a violent surge that left Jake breathless. The light from the box exploded, blinding them both. Jake felt as though his very soul was being pulled from his body, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The world around him dissolved, replaced by flashes of images, memories, feelings, and voices that weren't his own. He saw glimpses of the past, images of the crystal being hidden away, the door being sealed, and the world before the power was locked away. And then, he saw the future. A world on the brink of collapse, a world where the power they had just unleashed consumed everything in its path. He saw destruction, chaos, and a darkness that spread like wildfire. The vision shattered, and Jake found himself gasping for air, his hand still on the box. The girl was beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with the same shock and realization. "We have to stop it," she whispered. "Before it's too late." Jake nodded, his heart racing. He didn't know how they could stop it, but the girl was right. They had seen what would happen if they didn't act. The power was real, and it was up to them to control it. "How?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. The girl turned to him, her eyes burning with determination. "We have to close the door," she said, "before it consumes us all." Jake could feel the ground shift beneath him as the girl's words echoed in the air. The power they had unleashed was growing stronger, and the reality of what was at stake hit him hard. The energy around them was almost suffocating, filling the chamber with a constant hum, vibrating through his bones. He turned to the girl, her face now a mixture of fear and resolve. "How do we close the door?" Jake asked, his voice tight with urgency. The girl didn't answer right away. She was staring at the pedestal, where the glowing box still pulsed with an eerie light. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were fixed, unblinking, as though she was reading something only she could see. "We need to put everything back," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "The key, the crystal, everything we've disturbed. Only then can the door be closed again." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "The key," he repeated, his hand instinctively reaching for the object in his pocket. He hadn't realized it, but he had been holding it the entire time, his fingers pressed tightly around it. The girl nodded slowly. "Yes, the key opens the door, but it's the only thing that can also lock it again. We need to return it." Jake glanced at the crystal, the light from the box growing brighter as if it sensed their conversation. The power in the room was undeniable, almost like a living thing, reacting to their every move. "Where do we put it?" he asked, glancing around the room. The symbols on the walls shifted again, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was as if the very fabric of reality was bending and warping in response to their presence. "There," the girl said, pointing to the pedestal. The spot where the box had sat was now empty, the stone glowing with a faint but persistent light. "We placed the key in the center, just as it was before. But this time, we have to do it together." Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, holding the key firmly in his hand. His heart was still racing, but he knew what needed to be done. The girl stepped beside him, her hand reaching for the pedestal as well. They both stood there for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging over them. The silence in the room was deafening, the energy in the air thick enough to feel on their skin. Jake could feel the pull of the power around him, urging him to act. Without saying another word, they placed the key in the center of the pedestal. The moment it made contact with the stone, the light around them intensified. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and the walls shook again, this time harder than before. Jake grabbed the girl's hand instinctively, steadying her as the force around them grew stronger. The light from the pedestal exploded, blinding them both. Jake's mind was spinning. He couldn't tell if he was still standing or if the world had simply stopped moving. The power was overwhelming, like being caught in a storm of pure energy. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light faded. The hum in the air stopped. The walls fell silent. Jake blinked, trying to clear his vision. The room was still, the symbols on the walls dimming to a soft glow. The pedestal was now empty, the key having disappeared into the stone. The girl's hand tightened around his, and he looked at her, his breath shallow. "Did we do it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The girl didn't respond right away. She was staring at the pedestal, her eyes wide with shock and something else. Relief? Or was it fear? I think we did, she whispered. But the power, it's not gone. It's just dormant. Jake felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The power wasn't gone. It was dormant? What did that mean? What does that mean for us? Jake asked, his voice trembling. The girl turned to him, her face pale, but her eyes were steady. It means we've locked it away, she said softly. For now, but we've only delayed it. The door is still open, Jake. We haven't destroyed it. The weight of her words sank in. The door wasn't gone. The power wasn't gone. They had just sealed it for the moment, but the door was still there, waiting to be opened again. And whenever that happened, the consequences would be far worse. So what now? Jake asked. The girl's gaze flickered back to the empty pedestal, then back to him. Now, she said, her voice steady, we leave. We walk away, but we never forget what we've done. And we wait. Because it's not over. Jake nodded slowly, the reality of her words settling deep in his gut. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Whatever power they had unleashed, whatever door they had opened, would eventually come back for them. The question was, would they be ready when it did? With one last glance at the pedestal, Jake turned and began to walk toward the passageway that led back to the world outside. The girl followed beside him, her pace steady, but Jake could feel the weight of the journey pressing on her as much as it was on him. They had locked the door, but the consequences were still out there, waiting, and one day, they would have to face them. But for now, they walked in silence, the weight of the universe on their shoulders, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Jake and the girl stepped out of the chamber, the weight of what they had just done pressing down on them like an invisible burden. The air outside felt colder than it had before, as though the world itself had changed. The path back was silent, the echoes of their footsteps sounding louder in the quiet than they had ever seemed before. The crystal's glow was now distant, almost like a memory fading with each step they took. The girl walked beside him, her eyes still distant, lost in thought, while Jake tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. The power, the key, the door, it all felt like a nightmare he had only begun to wake from. But deep down, he knew the worst was far from over. He glanced at her, still walking with such purpose. We did what we could, Jake said, though his words lacked conviction. Did we? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't respond. What could he say? They had sealed the door, but it had only been a temporary fix. The power was still there, waiting to be unleashed again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the door they had closed wasn't really closed at all. It was just dormant, like a sleeping giant waiting for the right moment to wake up. You know it's not over, right? Jake finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. The girl nodded. I know, she said quietly. But we bought time. Time to prepare. Prepare for what? Jake asked, his frustration rising. For the return of the power, she said, her voice calm but firm. For when the door opens again. We may not have destroyed it, but we've delayed it. That's something. Something, Jake repeated, his voice bitter. He had hoped that by closing the door, they would have stopped whatever had been set in motion. But the truth was clear now. They hadn't stopped anything. They had only delayed the inevitable. The girl turned to him, her face softening. We did what we could, she repeated, her voice reassuring. And we still have time to figure out what comes next. Jake wanted to believe her. He really did. But the weight of what they had seen, what they had unleashed, was too much to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, and soon, the power would come back, stronger than ever. They reached the edge of the forest, the world outside now seeming normal again, too normal. The wind blew softly, the trees rustled in the distance, and for a moment, it felt like everything had returned to how it was before. But Jake knew better. He knew that nothing would ever be the same. So what now? Jake asked, looking at the girl, waiting for her to offer him some kind of solution, something that would ease the growing dread inside him. Now we wait, she said, her eyes scanning the horizon. We wait, and we prepare. We find those who can help us. We uncover the truth of the power and how to control it before it controls us. Jake shook his head. You really think we can control it? He asked, the words heavy with skepticism. She turned to him, her expression serious. I think we have to try. We don't have any other choice. Jake's chest tightened at the thought. Control? How could anyone control something that powerful? Something that seemed so far beyond their understanding? But as he looked at the girl, he realized that she wasn't just some ordinary person. She knew more than she was letting on, and she had been leading him through this whole journey with a quiet determination. Maybe she had the answers he was missing. Maybe, together, they could figure this out. What if we can't? Jake asked, his voice low. The girl gave him a small, almost sad smile. Then we fight. We fight with everything we have. Jake stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling in his mind. Fight. They were going to have to fight something they didn't fully understand, something that had the potential to destroy everything they knew. It was a fight neither of them had asked for, but one that they were already in. The girl began walking again, her pace steady, her eyes set ahead. Jake followed her, the weight of the future hanging over him. The fight was coming. There was no escaping it. But for the first time since they had opened the door, Jake felt a small spark of something inside him. A sense of purpose, perhaps. They weren't alone in this. They were in it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to give him the strength to face what was coming next. The silence stretched on as they walked, the path ahead uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, they would face it together. They had no other choice. And so, with the future still uncertain, they stepped forward into the unknown, ready to confront whatever the power they had unleashed would bring. The door may have closed, but the battle was far from over.